I'm Nicola Talent, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld. We're Ireland's top podcast for 2025, and now we've got a new website. So if you want to learn more about crime and criminals, if you want stories, extras, and podcast subscriber specials, go to www.crimeworld.com. Very welcome to the studio. And I think, Jennifer and Sam, people start off, we're not going to talk about this for very long, but we'll probably know you best from West Cork because it was such a phenomenon. To me, it was the first major big podcast. I think it got me hooked on them. A story that's so synonymous with Ireland. And I was just fascinated that you had moved here to do it and you had kind of totally relocated. It felt like real journalism again.
Of course, you very much beat us to the story. I remember hearing through Ian Bailey, your name came up a few times because I guess you and Donald,
we'd been down.
Had been going down to him,
but that was certainly podcast been in my realm. Yeah. That was kind of, I think we probably did a little bit of filming with him and, we were writing stories with him.
Yeah.
He kept in touch, of course. He used to ring me full of whiskey at night sometimes. Freak me out a bit. But it was a fantastic podcast. It's still been listened to. It still comes up and down the charts. I mean, it was such a success. When was it? What year?
2018.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. 2018, yeah. We didn't have any idea that it would be. Yeah. And I think increasingly now we realise it really is down to the luck we had with the people that we were working with, who were American and just very, they had kind of ambitions for it beyond what we could have seen, I think. And, really brought that idea of making it about the place. And I think the sense of place, West Cork is kind of what, it was such a different way of looking at the story, because I think it gave us our structure of kind of telling the story from the perspective of what it would have been like to live there at the time and experience it as it unfolded. And I think that really got us out of the hole of how do you tell this story to people that know it so well and have lived through it for the last 20 years and people who've never heard of Ian Bailey or Sophie Toscan de Plantier. So, just telling it kind of chronologically and letting the story unfold and the kind of character development that way allowed it to, as I say, it answered a lot of the questions that we had as to how you do that, I think.
And it is a beautiful place and it is quite multicultural in its own way, but at the same time, it's hard to go in as total outsiders to the story, I'm sure, and get people to trust you and talk to you. Yeah, that kind of becomes part of it, does it?
I think so. I think you could bring preconceptions to the idea, to all that, and I was just with a friend there the other day, a friend of Jennifer's, who had really put the fear into us about that particular thing, that no one's going to talk to you, you're wasting your time. A Dubliner, and he actually said, you know what, I haven't got much on, I'll come down with you for your first couple of trips and I'll smooth the ground. I don't know anyone there, but I've got the gift of gab or whatever. Anyway, we were down there. The first kind of time we were in the pubs after speaking to a few people, they said, you'll find it tough being an English person. Although the only thing worse than that would be if you're a dub. I don't think that would have helped it.
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't go down too well. But, and we all know the story of it, and there has been some documentaries made in the meantime. And of course, Ian Bailey passed away last year, I think it was. So the case remains unsolved, and you wonder, will there ever be an end to it? But who knows? I was interested, though, when I was listening to your new podcast, which is what we're here to talk about, the Havana Helmet Club, made for BBC 4
Yeah, BBC Sounds, but it went out on Radio 4 as well.
Went out on Radio 4.
Yeah,
so it's on BBC Sounds.
Yeah, or it's on everywhere.
It's on everywhere, yeah,
Spotify
because we have some difficulty getting some of the BBC stuff here.
Yeah.
But anyway, so you were kind of in West Cork, were you, when this story came on your radar?
That's right. When it first sort of it kind of came on everyone's radar as a sort of odd news item, we were finishing up West Cork. We're trying to desperately. And yeah, we had a newborn baby. The podcast was late. It was a tough time. But so, and I think we were kind of looking for escapism. And this story was in the papers at the time because it was all very sketchy back then, 2017. But supposedly a small group of American, US kind of spies and diplomats. So people working as diplomats in Cuba, in Havana, Cuba, or pretending to be diplomats, but actually working as CIA agents in Cuba, began to suffer a range of strange symptoms after hearing an odd and overpowering noise in their like rented accommodation in the evening around twilight. And sometimes they were in bed, sometimes they were like sitting on the veranda having a, mojito or something. And then, but they found themselves overpowered. And then a week or two later, they started feeling terrible, where they would get terrible brain fog. They would start like falling down. Their balance was terrible at work, and, headaches and inability to kind of concentrate on writing.
And a kind of a tinnitus with this ringing in the ear as well.
Yeah. So there's a thing where if you're sitting in the back of a moving car, and someone cracks one window, you get that funny baffling sound. So there was a range of things, but the stories back then were quite thin and filled with what turned out to be rumors. There was quite a lot of false rumors about the extent of what was going on. But there was this recording. Someone had made a recording of this strange sound. And so I think it was AP had it, and you could play it, and it was on Twitter. And I remember us sitting around playing it, and all the comments under the strange sound were, people making jokes about it sounding like aliens, or it's the Russians doing this, or it's the Cubans. So quickly, that was the idea that this was a weapon being directed at these people, and a weapon that no one had ever used before or heard tell of. And so we were kind of
playing it over and over again.
Yeah. I'm kind of half wondering. That was some of the comments.
Yeah.
Like, should we be doing this ourselves? Are we all going to get this problem in 2 weeks as well? But then, so kind of interested, and we started talking to people, and colleague Larry Ryan and I were sort of looking at it. Where could we do a story about this? And we did start working on it with the BBC. But we we talked to people around the edges, and it was this story that was kind of getting bigger and bigger. But people were getting cases cropping up all over the world with the same kind of thing.
Who hadn't necessarily been to Cuba?
Who hadn't ever been to Cuba.
Okay.
But they were all US spies or diplomats, or, working for the US government in some way. So we would talk to, doctors and diplomats and so on. But the story really changed for us and became what we've really were fascinated by when we managed to get in touch with one particular spy who's known as Patient Zero. And it was a long, tricky process, but then I had this call with him. It was just before Christmas one year, and he's somewhere at the end of the line, and have this call with him. And then I went to meet him in the UK, where he happened to be coming over for Christmas. And then I played Jennifer the tape when we got home, and that's when we kind of really changed our view of the story, right?
Yeah.
So there's a moment, I suppose, this is a bit train spotting for podcasters, but when you realise you have something and you've more than anybody else, and that's you have somebody intimate with the story, I think. You have so you have patient zero, he's agreed in principle maybe to talk to you, and so you have somebody really at the heart of the story. You need that for podcasting, especially to try and keep somebody's attention for so long.
Yeah.
I mean, you're looking for somebody to stay with you for up to 5 hours or whatever. You might record 500 hours, but you'll whittle it down.
Distilling it down, yeah.
So you start to see that you can actually do this.
The shape of it. Yeah.
I think so. And I think what was interesting about him was it was, because I think when we took it to the BBC, that was the big question. Is anyone going to talk to you? Because, we are not, this isn't our beat. So it was a bit similar, like you mentioned with West Cork. We would be very much kind of outsiders going into this closed world. I mean, it's the world of espionage. They're not traditionally people who talk to journalists. So it definitely felt like a coup to get this guy. But I think what was particularly interesting was that, this was a story. Sam was curious about it. He was kind of interested in it with our friend and producer Larry. They would send, messages about it back and forth. And, I am interested in Cuba. I'd been there a couple of times, but, am I interested in a hunt for a secret weapon? Maybe. Would I listen to a podcast about it? Probably not. Do you know what I mean? And then I listened to this interview. Sam did some recordings with this guy. And I was like, oh, this isn't just a victim of something in a straightforward way where he's going to tell you that this thing happened to them and then we'll move on. It felt like there was something about the way that he was talking that made me question whether I could trust him. And then it became, for me and for us, it just became something else. And it's not that I didn't trust that he would, I didn't trust him in terms of, I don't think he's lying. And we do believe that he experienced this thing and that he then went on this crazy journey of being kind of pushed out of the CIA, and to where he is at the end of the series, which is living in the mountains somewhere in America with weapons. He carries cameras everywhere because he believes that, the CIA, he became sort of persona non grata because he was a whistleblower, that kind of classic whistleblower story where initially he's trying to draw attention to this thing that happened to him. But he goes on this crazy journey of ultimately believing that the America are trying to kind of talk about this weapon underground because they themselves have one and they don't want anyone else to know about it. So he's trying to raise awareness on it, but he sort of is increasingly on the outs and feels increasingly vulnerable. And so you just are on this ride wondering, how big is this conspiracy going to go and how much am I willing to go there with him? At any point you can kind of get off the train and think,
this is mad.
Too much for me. Yeah, this is too mad. You've lost me. But certainly there are people who are with him the whole way. And I don't know if we necessarily are. But like I say, it just became this thing where the way he talks, his accent shifts, he's American, all the footage, he's American when he speaks in America on American interviews, but he was born in the UK. His parents are very English.
Yes.
And I know lots of people do that. Their accent jumps around, but it just made him feel like a more slippery character. More interesting, yeah.
Because he's also so, I can say as someone who spent a lot of time with him, he's extremely charming. Just gets on your level immediately. This is someone who I have nothing in common with in the face. I mean, we're both grew up.
Have you good spatial awareness?
No.
No,
It took me a
I
long
was
time to
listening
find
to
where-
that, and he was talking about to be chosen for the CIA to be a spy, you go through these rigorous tests, and one of the things that went with him was he had great spatial awareness. He could read maps and pack a suitcase.
Yeah.
I was like, I definitely can do neither of those things. I've obviously got very bad spatial awareness.
And the CIA haven't knocked on your door either.
No, they haven't, not yet. But I mean, I do have other attributes if they're out there.
Yeah, well, and he's such an improbable story as well. So like that whole world of like, whichever country's intelligence operatives or whatever, it's just, not only is it closed off, but you imagine that the people there are very sort of buttoned up and tight-lipped and just sort of straight-laced and all the rest of it. So they wouldn't necessarily... they're not necessarily going to be great characters, from the point of view of telling a story and contributors and all that. They're not necessarily going to be multi-dimensional, at least to you when they're talking to you. They're going to say exactly what they want to say, and not reveal anything more. But he just seems so open immediately when I met him, and like I say, very, very like affable and we're laughing straight away, and he'd. Messing around, and he just seemed so candid about everything, and he was willing to like say this and that about other people I'd spoken to, and he's very like didn't hold back about what he thought about this person being a stooge for the Cuban government or whatever it was. At the same time, as you spend more time with him, you realize kind of some of the reasons that he was good at his job, which is that he seems to be doing those things, but there's a whole other part of this that he never goes beyond certain boundaries.
He's keeping you out of.
Yeah, and also he's not just talking to me for his own health. He's got an agenda, just like he's no just.
Does anyone talk to us though without an agenda?
Yeah.
I think there's always an agenda, and sometimes you need to get to that. Certainly with the criminals, I think you have to try and get to that early, work out what their agenda is, and work out if you're okay with it.
Yeah.
Because if the agenda is to have someone murdered, not okay with that. If the agenda is because I don't like that other guy, so I'll give you this bit of information, just don't like him.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, sorry, you of course would be really used to like, you're being... they want access to your platform for whatever reason.
I think people do. I don't think people talk to journalists because they like them.
But we have a lot of experience of people who you really have to look out for, that they aren't criminals or politicians or whoever.
And they're not cautious enough themselves.
They're just, they don't understand how this is going to change their lives.
Yeah.
And I, not to talk about West Cork too much, but Ian Bailey, I feel like, despite all his, nonsense, I think he was very naive about how the media worked, what he thought he was getting out of talking to people, because he was so often totally stitched up in, after speaking to people.
Such an odd personality that, he would speak to journalists, he'd be trying to be funny or something, and it would come across.
Yeah.
Or he would trip himself up. I mean, very, very early, the whole reason he was ever named in it was because very early on he did an interview and he described himself as a chief suspect. So it meant people forever went on as the self-professed chief suspect, Ian Bailey. Otherwise he'd never have been named.
Yeah. I think that there was a similarity actually in the, except that one was more successful than the other, that Ian would kind of try and, he always felt, I think, like he was pulling strings and maneuvering things. He was always trying to play journalists off each other. And I'm sure you've experienced that. We certainly did. And he'd feel like if he had, if things were a bit quiet, he could stir things up. And we were so vulnerable to it, even when, you would say that's what's happening, but we've talked to Jim Sheridan about this because he would play us. We were kind of, at the same time we were working with Ian, but we were definitely the smaller outfit, and I think that helped us, because anytime the sort of Jim Sheridan machine rolled into town, we were absolutely second fiddle. Sorry, you can't do this today. Jim's coming around. Jim's coming around. So but for sure he would be saying the same thing to you know, to them. But I think that it was all so obvious. I mean, we always say Ian Bailey is sort of part sort of villain and part Alan Partridge. I mean, it was all so on show all the time.
See what he was up to.
Yeah. I think you can't help but feel a bit sorry for him in the end. But I think with Adam, with Patient Zero, as we kind of went along in the story, you realize that he was absolutely shaping it and pushing the right narrative into the media. And he would try and sort of have his cake and eat it a little bit by saying, I didn't talk to journalists. But behind the scenes, he was facilitating introductions and other people who'd been in Cuba alongside him, connecting them with journalists and, you know, making sure that the right story got pushed. And for sure, you wondered to an extent at the end, you know, he kind of really went to ground for a while. And then towards the end was when he knew that we were coming close to our conclusions, really got back in touch and was kind of
wanted to be central.
Yeah, and promising there's going to be an announcement soon. There's going to be a bit like a sort of a Ponzi scheme, you know, when you think, okay, any day, the money's coming in, any day, next Friday. Okay, not this week, next Friday. It didn't come in today, next Friday. And does it stop you saying, it's all a nonsense, because you think, I don't want to end up with egg on my face if next week they find the weapon, you know? So you are kind of like, it was an interesting dynamic, I think, for that. He just was a really interesting character, much more so than we imagined, you know, we would find, I think.
Should we jump back a little bit into the history of Cuba and why the CIA would have been there in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was sort of
a brief history of Cuba.
Yeah. Jennifer was, like I said, when we kind of delved into that, the few trips you'd made to Cuba, just to say our visas were denied twice actually during the production of this. We obviously wanted to go there, even though the action had like long since gone from Cuba. It was now in like Turkmenistan, people were getting attacked, or Vienna, or wherever. But Cuba's where it started, and where our that was the world we were fascinated by. It was the world of American spies in Cuba, and that kind of like crazy claustrophobic environment. So we wanted to go and see it ourselves. But anyway, and talk to the people who led the response to Havana Syndrome in Cuba. But they were just basically, they said yes, and then no. So I think the people at the top just didn't want anything to do with the story anymore. But anyhow, Jennifer had been there a couple of points when key moments in the, you know, just thinking of old, what's the wrestler who you went to see?
Jesse Ventura.
She went to see Jesse Ventura when she was there.
Randomly.
What year was that?
2002, I think. So there have been kind of, you know, which I was there with an American, and so we'd had to go via Costa Rica because at the time you couldn't. It was at one of those times when they couldn't go, and she put $20 in her passport so they don't stamp it, so she doesn't get asked questions on the way back. She was from the same state as Minnesota, as Jesse Ventura, which was Minnesota. And weirdly, there's just been sort of various times when random American celebrities, or there were Minnesotan farmers who'd gone over and tried to sort of broker some peace deal or have better relations. And I think that the way, you know, we were sort of interested in the story, I think, because it gave an opportunity to look at the really rich and fascinating history of between America and Cuba.
For sure.
So we've sort of told it, the series is kind of the story, and it's kind of two parallel tracks. You're with Adam, Patient Zero, and his story of what happened to him, and he tells a very convincing story that, and he is very easily able to kind of tie all the threads of it together in one narrative. But there is another narrative that sort of sits alongside it, which could also explain what's going on, and
it's
that
the paranoia stuff.
Absolutely, there's the paranoia of the because there have been some incredible situations that American spies are in Cuba. I mean, we sort of think of it as this holiday destination of salsa and, cocktails and, big kind of shows. But there's, whatever you believe on Havana Syndrome, and whether there is this sort of sonic weapon or, energy ray, the Cuban intelligence do terrible things to American spies and vice versa, but sort of taping scorpions to the inside of their clothes. They can just take it as a given that they're being recorded all the time, everywhere.
They definitely mess with their heads.
Yeah.
And I mean, you're talking to CIA personnel who are in there from the 80s. So Fidel Castro obviously makes the Americans pretty paranoid, brings in some communism, sort of is in bed, they believe, with the Soviet Union, and is using all these dirty tricks, really, because he doesn't want the Americans there. I wanted to ask, how are those CIA agents coming in as what?
Diplomats.
As diplomats.
Yes, so they're really they would be given
spies. Yeah.
I mean, that's incredible because that's happening all over the world. What is it? Isn't there a statistic? It's like 40% or something of staff at US embassies around the world are actually CIA agents.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the easiest cover. Because,
well, you can move about and you can mix and mingle, and
quite a lot of crossover with those jobs. With a kind of diplomat, it's about business outreach, and so in the case of Adam, he had a job there, which I think is classified, whatever it was. But he had, showed us his business card and had his real name on it. And so it involved going out to say, to areas of business, say in Havana or elsewhere, down at the docks or wherever, where you might actually take a little surreptitious photograph while you're there talking to, whoever it is about increasing business ties with American things. So it's I think it's a useful cover. And
but you need some cover because, especially I suppose in the 80s, Americans couldn't just sort of land there and, hey, I'm living here now.
Yeah.
You need something to
But I think
drop in.
It happens because it's funny, while we were reporting on this story, I know somebody here in Dublin who rented their house out, and they rented it out to two people who were working at the American embassy, 2 Americans. And they were the people who own the house were told they're working at the airport, they're stationed at the American embassy, they're going to be here for a couple of years. Cut to the house, their curtains are drawn all the time. I think they had to go around for something. The whole front room is full of computer equipment. They had to have a safe room in the house.
Right.
They boarded up the window. I mean, there's no way these people were just straightforward embassy workers doing passport checks at the airport. So, I mean, it was a kind of funny sort of switcheroo of suddenly reading the world differently. And they do fill your head with this idea that it's happening all the time,
But the Americans here in Dublin aren't, suffering the same kind of surveillance, I suppose, that back in the 80s and onwards that these spies did in Cuba, because they talk about they were followed everywhere. People sat outside their homes. They broke into their homes at night and did weird things just to show them that, this isn't really, we're here, wasn't it? It was, it was a real kind of
time.
But it must have taken a huge amount of work to do that, and a huge amount of Cuban operatives to do that in that discreet fashion, but really messing with people's heads. The psychology of that is coming from where?
Well, I mean, one thing to bear in mind with, certainly in the now, I guess too, for the US, Cuba is actually really just this kind of domestic political issue, which we sort of learned a bit about, how it was about the kind of Cuban immigrants who have a bone to pick about Castro, and that regime. That's the extent to which Cuba is on the radar, really, for most American government. But in Cuba, the US is the only game in town. I mean, because it's such an oppressive regime and everything for them, oppressive force with all the sanctions and stuff, they are all focused on all those, the Cuban intelligence service. It would be the primary thing. Find out what those guys are doing
Mm-hmm.
and mess with them if you want, because it's obviously they're there to gather intelligence in an adversarial way.
Mm.
And like we said, it's a good cover to be a diplomat, but according to the agents we spoke to, it's as far as it's a sort of total fig leaf. Like all the Cuban intelligence know who you are before you step off the plane, kind of thing. And it's not just about finding out what they're doing. It's not just about surveillance. It's about the way these guys talked about it. It's to let you know that they own you while you're there, kind of thing. It's to try to get in your head, and to the extent that you don't know when something happens whether they are responsible for that terrible thing that happened to you, or whether you've imagined it, or whether some combination of the two things. So like
you end up living in a complete state of paranoia.
Yeah.
Where you can't function.
There's no privacy.
As well as you can function without that.
Yeah.
So what they're sending back, the way they work it is the intelligence they're sending back is skewed, or?
Well, maybe less reliable. And the other thing is like they're constantly being bested by or they were in the 80s. That Suzanne Matthews, who Jennifer spoke to, a former agent from that kind of period, said just before she came, there was this massive hoo-ha where they had been working, all these agents, like dozens of Cuban assets, right? People in Cuba who were supposedly feeding them intelligence turned out to all be Cuban spies, who were like and they'd been filming them, and they broadcast this special TV show showing all these like dead drops that what the Americans thought were like exchanging information, but it's all candid camera. They were totally played, and so you feel like you're on a completely uneven footing there. And that's immediately that Adam arrived.
What year did he arrive?
It was 2016, right?
16, yeah.
Yeah, so just as America was finally...
Yeah, at this point, 2016, America is still, it's got a foothold in, but it's not...
They've, after whatever it is, 50 years of Cold War antagonism, Obama really did do this like historic kind of reopening of relations with Castro. And it was called the Thaw, and it was this big, really huge deal, historic, especially for Cuba. This changing of relations where everyone's going to open up, stop being so aggressive, drop the sanctions, start doing business with this island that's like 50 miles off of Florida.
Yeah.
And so that was all really exciting, and that's part of the reason Adam was there, was that new business, new flights, new everything, and he's there. As part of that, but also as a CIA saw an opportunity to send more people there to gather intelligence. And so it was, but just at that same time, he says there was a huge ramping up of like attacks on these spies,
right.
like intimidation and harassment.
So the hand of friendship coming from the US wasn't quite seen as that. It was...
Yeah, at least by some, yeah.
Yeah, but it was, I think that that's what was quite interesting, is looking at the kind of the history of antagonism, and certainly whether or not the CIA would have been necessarily in line politically with the States, or whether they would have found it quite hard to let go of that kind of age-old, kind of really entrenched view of Cuba as the enemy. I mean, I think going back to the revolution 1959, when, before that, Cuba was like a kind of Miami. It was like a playground, kind of Vegas, it was built by mob money, casinos, hotels. Frank Sinatra went over and did shows. So it was, a lot of people felt like it was just a kind of annex of the States. So Castro seizing power, seized money and property, and lots of the Cubans who were anti-Castro fled to Miami, where they put down roots, but really imagined it was just going to be a temporary exile, that at some point they would go back to Cuba. But that's kind of really, it was interesting to kind of look at the history and see how much that has fed into American politics. And a lot of those Cubans who became who stayed in America, in this kind of limbo, rose up to, I mean, they were all quite wealthy in Cuba. So, they were all educated, wealthy Cubans who then built big businesses in Miami, got huge power over time. I mean, Marco Rubio came out of that community. So they have consistently put pressure on the States to keep that kind of antagonistic approach to Cuba. They don't want peace. They don't want a deal. They just want Castro out or the regime out and to take their country back. So to kind of see any opportunity that has come up over the past decades that they've had to be able to paint Cuba as the bad guy, they've taken. So seeing Havana Syndrome through that lens was really fascinating, because suddenly, Marco Rubio happens to be at a particular point in his career when he can actually make hay of this new story that's coming out of Cuba. And it was sort of interesting to see how quickly all of what, as Sam was saying, with Obama came tumbling down. So Obama was the first president to have been able to take it that far, to go over, open arms, say this, let's just bury the hatchet, let's a fresh start. Adam goes over, and within months of Obama having been there in the march, he starts experiencing this weird kind of sensation. And they're kind of going in with this history behind them. He's been briefed, don't bring anything you're not willing to leave behind. He's a complete novice. He comes, a few years ago, he's giving kind of, traffic. What did he say? He's a traffic cop.
Yeah.
And he's suddenly dropped in. Cuba is his first post. And it's sort of, and it feels like the opening of a movie. You've got this history, but everybody's saying it's a new start, it's ancient history, we're all friends now, but under the scenes, you're not quite under the surface. Is there still that tension that's there? And it feels like quite quickly people realize, yes,